The letter in my hands was shaking so hard I could barely read it, but the words on the legal document were crystal clear. Timothy Garcia, that was my name, and somehow this 300-acre ranch in Montana had my name on the title. The lawyer, Donald Lopez, was explaining something about inheritance laws and distant relatives, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. 18 years old, 3 days out of the state group home, sleeping in my beat-up Honda Civic, and now this stranger was telling me I owned land I'd never seen from family I'd never known existed. The ranch house stood before me now, weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch that had seen better decades. Behind it, endless fields stretched toward mountains that looked like they were painted against the sky. I'd driven 12 hours straight from Denver, surviving on gas station coffee and the kind of hope that felt dangerous to hold on to. My entire life fit in 2 garbage bags in my back seat, and yet apparently I owned all of this. Sharon Mendoza, the local real estate agent who'd met me at the property, was watching me with curious eyes. She was maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that had spent years in the sun. She'd been the one to track me down through the state system, following a paper trail that led back to my great-uncle Charles Parker, a man whose name I'd never heard spoken aloud. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments, because this story is about to take turns I never saw coming. Standing there on what was supposedly my land, I felt like I was living someone else's life. The group home where I'd spent the last 4 years had been a concrete building in downtown Denver, surrounded by chain link and the constant hum of traffic. This place was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Sharon was explaining something about property taxes and maintenance costs, but I was still stuck on the impossible fact that someone had left me something. In 18 years, I'd never been left anything except alone. The key she handed me was old brass, worn smooth by decades of use. It turned easily in the front door lock, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old wood and something else I couldn't identify. Later, I'd realize it was the scent of a home where people had actually lived and loved and built a life together. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but underneath I could see the shapes of a couch, chairs, a dining table. Family furniture, the kind I'd only seen in movies. Sharon left me alone to explore, saying she'd be back in the morning to go over paperwork. I walked through the house like I was touring a museum of someone else's memories. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, faces I didn't recognize, but shared my dark hair and stubborn jawline. Charles Parker appeared in several of them, a tall man with calloused hands and kind eyes. In one picture, he was standing next to a woman with a bright smile, both of them squinting into the sun with the ranch spread out behind them. The kitchen had a wood-burning stove and a table scarred by years of use. I found myself running my fingers along the scratches and dents, wondering about the meals that had been shared here, the conversations that had filled this space. In the refrigerator, long since cleaned out, someone had left a note held by a magnet. "Welcome home, Timothy. Your Uncle Charles wanted you to have this place. He talked about you often, even though he never got to meet you. The lawyer has more information. Give this old ranch the love it deserves. Gloria Johnson, neighbor." I'd never had a neighbor before. In the group home, we had roommates and supervisors and caseworkers, but never neighbors. People who looked out for each other just because they lived nearby. The concept felt foreign and wonderful at the same time. That first night, I slept in the master bedroom on a mattress that smelled like lavender and old quilts. I'd expected to lie awake, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all, but instead I fell into the deepest sleep I'd had in years. Maybe it was exhaustion from the drive, or maybe it was the first time I'd ever felt truly safe. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over fields that apparently belonged to me. Gloria Johnson showed up around 8 a.m. in the morning with coffee and what she called real breakfast. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me at ease. She took one look at my confusion and launched into what she called the full briefing. Charles Parker had been my grandmother's brother, she explained. My grandmother had left Montana as a young woman, moved to Colorado, and somewhere along the way the family had lost touch. Charles had spent years trying to track down his sister's descendants, hiring private investigators and working with genealogy services. By the time he found me, I was already in the system, and he'd been told that contacting me directly might disrupt my placement. So he'd waited and planned and made sure that when I turned 18, this ranch would be mine. He used to sit on that porch every evening, Gloria told me, pointing toward the front of the house. Said he was waiting for his family to come home. Guess he knew you'd make it here eventually. The story should have felt like a fairy tale, but sitting in that kitchen with Gloria's homemade biscuits and the morning sun warming my face, it felt real in a way nothing in my life ever had. This wasn't some temporary placement or transitional housing. This was mine, not just until I aged out or messed up or the funding ran out. Mine. Donald Lopez, the lawyer, arrived later that morning with a briefcase full of documents and what he called the full picture. The ranch came with complications, he explained. Property taxes that were months behind, equipment that needed repair, and a learning curve that would be steep for someone with no farming experience. Charles had left some money for immediate expenses, but not enough to carry the place indefinitely. If I wanted to keep it, I'd need to make it work. The challenge should have scared me off. 18 years old with no family, no experience, and no safety net. But looking out at those fields, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Purpose. This wasn't just land, it was a legacy. Someone had believed in me enough to leave me their life's work. Charles Parker had never met me, but he'd trusted me with everything that mattered to him. Gloria introduced me to Kyle Wright, a man in his 40s who'd worked as Charles's ranch hand for over a decade. Kyle had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, with permanent squint lines from years of sun and wind. He was quiet at first, clearly sizing me up, probably wondering if this city kid had any business trying to run a ranch. "Your uncle was a good man," Kyle finally said. "Worked this land like it was sacred. If you're planning to stay, you'll need to learn fast. Ranch doesn't wait for anyone to catch up." I spent the next few weeks following Kyle around like a lost puppy, learning the basics of ranch life. How to check fences, tend to the small herd of cattle Charles had maintained, operate equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. My hands, soft from years of indoor living, quickly developed calluses and cuts. My back ached from work I'd never imagined doing. But every evening, sitting on that porch where Charles used to wait for family to come home, I felt more connected to something real than I ever had in my life. The neighbors were cautious but kind. Dennis Allen, who ran the feed store in town, extended credit without being asked, saying Charles had always been good for his word, and he figured that ran in the family. Christina Baker, who owned the diner on Main Street, made sure I knew I was welcome for coffee anytime I needed to escape the isolation of ranch life. Julie Anderson, the librarian, helped me find books on ranching and farming, creating a stack of resources that grew taller every week. Slowly, I began to understand what Charles had seen in this place. It wasn't just land, it was a way of life that connected you to something larger than yourself. The rhythm of the seasons, the responsibility of caring for animals, the satisfaction of work that produced something tangible and necessary. In the group home, I'd felt like I was just taking up space, waiting for real life to begin. Here, every day mattered. But 3 months in, just as I was starting to feel like I might actually be able to make this work, everything changed. Cheryl Howard showed up at my door with a briefcase and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, claiming to represent Charles Parker's, quote, 8 family. She had documents, she said, proving that the will was invalid and that the ranch rightfully belonged to her clients, distant cousins who'd only recently learned of Charles's death. The legal papers she thrust into my hands might as well have been written in a foreign language. But the threat was clear. She was giving me 30 days to vacate the property before they filed suit to reclaim it. All those weeks of learning to belong somewhere, of building connections with neighbors who'd begun to feel like family, of finally having a place that was mine, suddenly felt like it was built on sand. I sat on the porch that night, staring out at fields that might not be mine much longer, feeling more lost than I had even in my worst days in the system. At least then I'd known what to expect. This felt like having something precious dangled in front of me, just long enough to want it desperately before having it snatched away. Kyle found me there the next morning, still in the same chair, still holding Cheryl Howard's legal papers. He took one look at my face and sat down beside me without saying anything for a long time. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, Your uncle dealt with something similar about 10 years back. Different relatives. Same story. Vultures who show up when they smell money. What happened? I asked. Charles fought them, had to mortgage part of the ranch to pay legal fees, but he won. Turns out his will was solid, and their claim was based on forged documents. Kyle stood up and stretched, then looked down at me with something that might have been respect. Question is, you planning to fight or you planning to run? The question stayed with me as I drove into town to meet with Donald Lopez. The lawyer's office was in a converted house on Main Street, all creaking floors and mismatched furniture. But Donald himself inspired confidence. He'd been Charles's lawyer for 20 years, he explained, and he'd helped draft the will that left me the ranch. Every I was dotted, every T crossed. Cheryl Howard has a reputation, Donald said, leaning back in his chair. She specializes in inheritance disputes, usually representing people who show up after someone dies claiming they're the rightful heirs. Sometimes she's legitimate, sometimes she's not. In this case, I'm betting she's fishing. The problem was proving it. Legal battles cost money, and while Charles had left me enough to cover immediate expenses, a prolonged court fight could bankrupt me before I ever got to keep the ranch. Donald suggested we start by investigating Howard's clients, seeing if their claim had any merit before we decided how to respond. That investigation led me deeper into my own family history than I'd ever imagined going. Charles had kept meticulous records, not just of ranch business, but of his search for his sister's family. I found folders full of genealogy research, correspondence with private investigators, and copies of birth certificates and marriage licenses going back generations. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd spent the last 20 years of his life trying to reconnect with family he'd lost touch with decades earlier. My grandmother, Sarah Parker Garcia, had left Montana in 1955 to marry my grandfather in Colorado. She'd maintained contact with Charles for a few years, but life had gotten in the way. Letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. By the time Charles started actively searching for her in the early 2000s, she'd been dead for over a decade, and my father had died in a car accident when I was 2. My mother had struggled with addiction and lost custody of me when I was 6. Charles had found all of this out through his investigation, and it had only made him more determined to find me. Reading through his files, I found copies of letters he'd written to various state agencies, trying to get information about me while respecting the system's rules about contact with minors and care. He'd known about my existence for over 5 years before his death, had followed my progress through school, had even attended my high school graduation from the back of the auditorium without identifying himself. The knowledge that someone had been watching out for me, even from a distance, even when I felt completely alone, was overwhelming. But Charles's research also revealed something else. The quote 15 Cheryl Howard claimed to represent weren't distant at all. They were the children of Charles's brother Marcus, who died 15 years earlier. Marcus had never married, had no children of his own, and had been estranged from Charles for decades over a dispute about their parents' farm. The people claiming to be Marcus's children were using forged birth certificates and fabricated family stories. Armed with this information, Donald Lopez filed a motion to dismiss Howard's claim and requested an investigation into her client's documentation. The process would still take months, but we had a strong case. In the meantime, I could stay on the ranch and continue learning to run it as long as I was prepared for the possibility that the legal fight might not go our way. That uncertainty hung over everything I did for the next several months. I threw myself into ranch work with an intensity that probably worried my neighbors, but it was the only way I could deal with the anxiety of not knowing if any of it would matter in the end. Kyle taught me to repair fencing, to recognize signs of illness in cattle, to operate machinery that seemed held together by prayer and stubbornness. Gloria Johnson became something like a grandmother, showing up with food whenever she thought I was getting too thin and offering advice I didn't know I needed. The town itself began to feel like home in ways I'd never expected. Dennis Allen at the feed store started calling me by name instead of Charles's nephew, a small recognition that felt huge. Christina Baker at the diner saved me a piece of pie whenever she made my favorite. And Julie Anderson at the library helped me research everything from soil management to livestock breeding. These weren't people who were paid to care about me or who were required to include me. They were choosing to make me part of their community. But the legal case dragged on, and the stress of not knowing whether I'd be able to keep the ranch began to take its toll. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was fooling myself. Maybe I didn't belong here. Maybe I was just a kid from the system who'd gotten lucky for a while, and now reality was catching up with me. The breaking point came on a cold morning in February when one of the older cows got sick and I had to call the veterinarian. Standing in the barn, watching Dr. Martinez examine the animal, I realized I was genuinely worried about her. Not because she represented money or property, but because she was under my care. I was responsible for her well-being, and that responsibility meant something to me in a way nothing ever had before. That's when I knew I couldn't give up. Whatever happened with the legal case, I'd found something worth fighting for. This wasn't just about inheriting property, it was about inheriting a way of life that had given me purpose and belonging. Charles Parker had trusted me with his legacy, and I owed it to him and to myself to see it through. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March. I wore the only dress shirt I owned, borrowed a tie from Kyle, and tried to look like someone who deserved to inherit a ranch. Cheryl Howard arrived with her clients, a man and woman in their 50s, who avoided making eye contact with me. They looked nervous, which Donald Lopez said was a good sign. The hearing itself was less dramatic than I'd expected. Donald presented Charles's will, along with documentation of his thorough search for legitimate heirs. He showed the court the genealogy research, the correspondence with state agencies, and the clear paper trail that led from Charles Parker to me. Then he presented the evidence that Howard's clients were using forged documents to support their claim. Howard tried to argue that Charles's mental state at the time he wrote the will was questionable, that leaving a ranch to an unknown great-nephew showed poor judgment. But Donald had medical records showing Charles was in good health and sound mind right up until his death from a heart attack. He also had testimony from neighbors and business associates who could attest to Charles's competence and his expressed desire to find his family. The judge took less than an hour to rule in my favor. Not only was Charles's will valid and legally binding, but Howard's clients were facing potential charges for document fraud. The ranch was mine, free and clear, with no further legal challenges possible. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Kyle was waiting in the parking lot, along with Gloria Johnson and several other neighbors who'd driven the 40 miles to town just to support me. They didn't make a big deal out of it, just nodded and said they were glad it was settled. But I could see the relief in their faces. They'd been invested in my success too. That evening, sitting on the porch where Charles used to wait for family to come home, I finally understood what he'd been waiting for. Not just me specifically, but the continuation of something he'd built. The ranch wasn't just land and buildings. It was a legacy of hard work and connection to the community and stewardship of something larger than any one person. Over the following months, I threw myself into learning everything I could about running the place properly. I enrolled in agricultural extension courses, joined the local cattlemen's association, and spent hours talking to older ranchers who were generous with their knowledge. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done, but it was also more satisfying than anything I'd ever imagined. By the time summer arrived, I was starting to feel like I actually knew what I was doing. The cattle were healthy, the fields were productive, and I was even turning a small profit. More importantly, I was part of the community in a way that felt natural and earned. When the volunteer fire department needed help with a fundraiser, I volunteered. When a neighbor's fence came down in a storm, I showed up with tools and time. When the high school FFA chapter needed someone to speak about ranch management, I found myself standing in front of a classroom full of kids, sharing what I'd learned. The first-year anniversary of my arrival at the ranch fell on a warm day in late August. I marked it by riding the property lines on horseback, something Kyle had taught me to do as a way of checking fences and just staying connected to the land. From the highest hill on the property, I could see the entire ranch spread out below me, golden fields stretching toward the mountains, cattle grazing peacefully, the house and barn looking solid and well-maintained. It was hard to believe that just a year earlier, I'd been sleeping in my car, wondering where I'd end up next. The transformation wasn't just in my circumstances, but in who I'd become. The uncertain, rootless teenager who'd left the group home had been replaced by someone who knew his place in the world, who had responsibilities and relationships and a future that stretched beyond just surviving to the next day. That evening, Gloria Johnson brought over a cake to celebrate what she called my, quote, 17. We sat on the porch with Kyle and Dennis Allen and several other neighbors, watching the sun set over land that was undeniably, legally, permanently mine. The conversation was easy and comfortable, the kind that happens between people who know each other well and have shared experiences to draw from. Quote, after 18th, Gloria said as the evening wound down. Quote, I thought about that as I did my evening chores, checking on the cattle and making sure everything was secure for the night. Charles Parker had never met me, but he'd somehow known I was the right person to inherit his life's work. He'd seen potential in a kid he'd never spoken to, had faith that I could learn what I needed to learn and become who I needed to become. The responsibility of that trust was something I carried with me every day. Not as a burden, but as a motivation to keep growing, keep learning, keep proving worthy of the gift I'd been given. The ranch was teaching me things I'd never learned in 18 years of institutional living. How to plan for the future, how to take care of something larger than myself, how to be part of a community that depended on each other. As winter approached, I found myself looking forward to the challenges instead of dreading them. I'd learned enough to know what needed to be done to prepare for cold weather, and I had neighbors who'd help if I got in over my head. The isolation that might have bothered me before felt peaceful now. I had work that mattered, land that was mine, and a place where I belonged. The second legal challenge came in November, this time from a different lawyer representing what they claimed were Charles's true heirs. But this time I was ready. Donald Lopez and I had learned from the first case, and we documented everything thoroughly. The challenge was dismissed even faster than the first one, and word got around that the Parker Ranch wasn't vulnerable to frivolous inheritance claims. By the time I'd been on the ranch for 2 years, I was no longer the uncertain teenager who'd arrived with everything he owned in garbage bags. I was a rancher with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin and the kind of practical knowledge that comes only from daily experience. I'd learned to read the weather, to judge the health of cattle by their behavior, to fix equipment with whatever materials were available. More importantly, I'd learned what it meant to be part of something larger than myself. The ranch was connected to the community in dozens of ways, from buying supplies at local businesses to participating in cooperative efforts like shared equipment and mutual aid during emergencies. I wasn't just Timothy Garcia who happened to live on a ranch. I was Timothy Garcia who belonged to this place, in this community. The financial side of ranching had been one of the steepest learning curves, but I'd figured that out too. With Kyle's help and advice from other ranchers, I developed a business plan that balanced traditional cattle ranching with some newer approaches to land management. I'd started a small side business boarding horses for city people who wanted their animals to have access to pasture, and I was exploring opportunities in agritourism that could provide additional income while sharing the ranch lifestyle with others. But the real measure of my success wasn't financial. It was the sense of belonging I felt every morning when I stepped out onto the porch and looked out over land that was mine to care for. I'd found my place in the world, and it was exactly where Charles Parker had hoped it would be. The phone call that changed everything again came on a Tuesday morning in March, almost 3 years after I'd first arrived at the ranch. It was from a social worker in Denver calling about a 15-year-old boy who just aged out of the same group home where I'd spent my final years. His name was Marcus, and like me, he had no family and nowhere to go. Unlike me, he didn't have a mysterious inheritance waiting for him. The social worker had heard about my story somehow, and she wondered if I might be willing to mentor Marcus, maybe let him spend some time on the ranch learning life skills before he had to make it on his own. It wasn't a formal placement, just a chance for a kid who needed guidance to spend time with someone who'd been where he was. I said yes without hesitation, not because I felt obligated, but because I remembered what it felt like to be 18 and alone and uncertain about the future. If the ranch had taught me anything, it was that we're all connected, that we have responsibilities to each other that go beyond just taking care of ourselves. Marcus arrived on a Friday afternoon carrying the same kind of garbage bags I'd brought 3 years earlier. He was suspicious and defensive and trying hard not to show how scared he was. I recognized all of it because I'd felt all of it myself. But I also saw something else in him, the same potential that Charles Parker had somehow seen in me. Teaching Marcus what I'd learned felt like completing a circle. He was resistant at first, convinced that ranch work was beneath him, that he was destined for something bigger and more important. But gradually, as he began to understand the satisfaction of physical work and the peace of wide-open spaces, his attitude started to change. Kyle took to Marcus immediately, treating him with the same patient instruction he'd given me. Gloria Johnson added another place at her dinner table and started sending home extra food for the boys. The community that had welcomed me began to welcome Marcus too, not because they had to, but because that's what communities do. Watching Marcus discover his own capabilities, seeing him gain confidence and purpose, reminded me how far I'd come. 3 years earlier, I'd been just as lost and uncertain as he was. The ranch had given me more than just a home and a livelihood. It had given me an identity and a future and a way to contribute something meaningful to the world. By the end of that summer, Marcus was talking about staying permanently, maybe working toward eventually taking over some of the ranch operations. I encouraged him to finish high school first, to take advantage of educational opportunities I'd never had, but I also made it clear that there would be a place for him here as long as he wanted it. The ranch was big enough for both of us, and the work was certainly more than one person could handle alone. More than that, having Marcus there felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain. Charles Parker had left me this place because he believed in family, even family you've never met. Now I was creating family of my own, not through blood, but through choice and shared experience and mutual commitment. As I write this, it's been 5 years since I first drove up the dirt road to the ranch that had my name on the title. Marcus is now 20 and my full partner in running the operation. We've expanded the cattle herd, improved the pastures, and built the horse boarding business into something that provides steady supplemental income. More importantly, we've created something that feels like the family neither of us had growing up. The house that once felt too big for one person now feels full of life and purpose. Marcus has his own room, but we share meals and responsibilities and the kind of easy companionship that comes from working toward common goals. Kyle is still with us, now officially the ranch foreman and unofficially the grandfather neither of us had. Gloria Johnson continues to mother us both, and the wider community has embraced our unconventional family with the same warmth they showed me when I first arrived. Last month, we got a call from the same social worker who'd connected me with Marcus. "There's another kid aging out of the system," she said, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah who's shown interest in agricultural programs but has nowhere to go after graduation. Would we be willing to meet with her, maybe offer the same kind of mentorship that had worked so well with Marcus? Of course we said yes. The ranch has taught us that there's always room for one more person who's willing to work hard and contribute to something larger than themselves. Sarah will arrive next month and we're already planning how to integrate her into the operation, how to help her discover her own capabilities and find her own place in this community we've built. I think Charles Parker would approve. He left me this ranch not just because I was his great-nephew, but because he understood that some legacies are meant to be shared, meant to grow and change and adapt to new circumstances. The ranch isn't just a piece of property anymore. It's a place where kids who've aged out of the system can learn what it means to belong somewhere, to be part of something that matters. The financial success of the ranch has been gratifying, but it's not what gets me up in the morning. What motivates me is the knowledge that we're creating something that will outlast any of us individually. We're building a legacy of belonging, of found family, of second chances, and new beginnings. Every kid who comes through here and learns that they have value and potential and a place in the world is part of that legacy. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, in the same spot where Charles Parker used to wait for family to come home, and I think about how strange and wonderful life can be. 5 years ago, I was sleeping in my car, convinced that I was destined to be alone forever. Now I'm surrounded by family I chose and who chose me back. Living on land that's taught me what it means to be rooted somewhere. Part of a community that values contribution over credentials and character over background. The ranch has given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home that's truly mine, work that matters, relationships built on mutual respect and shared goals, and a future that stretches beyond just surviving to the next day. But more than that, it's given me the opportunity to pass those gifts on to others who need them as much as I did. This story doesn't end with me. It continues with Marcus and Sarah and whoever comes after them. The ranch that had my name on the title has become something bigger than ownership. It's become a place where family is created rather than inherited, where belonging is earned through commitment and care rather than blood relation. If you're watching this and you've aged out of the system, or you know someone who has, I want you to understand something important. Your story doesn't have to end with aging out. There are people and places and opportunities waiting for you, even if you can't see them yet. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you were born into. It's the one you create through choice and commitment and shared purpose. The ranch taught me that belonging isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build through daily actions and choices. Every fence I've repaired, every animal I've cared for, every neighbor I've helped, every young person I've mentored has been part of building the place where I belong. It's not about finding your place in the world. It's about creating your place in the world. Charles Parker gave me more than land and buildings when he left me this ranch. He gave me the opportunity to discover who I could become when I had something worth working for and people who believed in my potential. He showed me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself. So tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you someone who's found their place in the world? Or are you still searching? Have you ever been given a second chance that changed everything? Share your stories because they matter, because they remind all of us that we're not alone in this journey. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or made you think about family and belonging in a new way, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that our stories aren't over, that there are still chapters to be written, still places to belong, still families to be found or created. The ranch that had my name on the title became the home that had my heart written all over it, and that's a legacy worth passing on.